On December 20th, 1944, in Luxembourg City, the phone connection hissed with restrained anger, while General Omar Bradley clutched the handset, his fingers blanching against the dark bakelight. From the other end, Dwight Eisenhower's steady tone conveyed a directive that pushed their bond to the edge. The 1st and 9th American armies were now falling under British authority, specifically Montgomery's. "Damn it, Ike, I won't answer to the folks back home if you go through with this," Bradley burst out, his calm Missouri demeanor cracking at last. "I quit." The top commander's reply arrived sharp and unyielding. "Brad, the accountability to the American public rests with me, not you, so your resignation carries no weight." Bradley hesitated, lodged one final objection, and then went quiet. This episode, lost amid the turmoil of Hitler's Ardennes push, captured 3 years of growing U.S. irritation toward a British field marshal intent on showing he could secure victory single-handedly. Bernard L. Montgomery, conqueror of El Alamein and Britain's champion, had evolved into the most contentious presence in the Allied leadership. Yet the query that plagued U.S. bases from Tunisia to Germany boiled down to something straightforward and accusatory. Why did an alliance battling Nazi oppression for its very existence fracture not from foe assaults, but from one individual's temperament? The explanation didn't stem from any isolated event, but from a buildup of episodes, choices, and conflicts that started in North Africa's dunes and concluded in Northwest Europe's sludge. This narrative traces how tactical brilliance turned into a strategic liability, how patriotism clashed with coalition demands, and how U.S. leaders grew to regard their leading British ground force chief with feelings spanning from irritation to near despise. The equation of joint command appeared straightforward on the surface, yet brimmed with political intricacies. By the end of 1944, U.S. personnel in Europe far exceeded British numbers. American manufacturing prowess overshadowed Britain's strained wartime production. Still, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery appeared inherently unable to recognize these truths or adapt his conduct. In American perceptions, Montgomery embodied precisely what they had rebelled against: elite arrogance, imperial patronizing, and a firm conviction in Britain's dominance. Yet, he wasn't a stereotype. His intellect shone through genuinely, his planning was thorough, and his regard for troop safety won him loyalty from his men. His triumph stood firm, his battlefield insight beyond question. British ranks, scarred by initial setbacks, saw in him a leader who claimed successes without racking up excessive losses. Churchill held him dear. The UK populace idolized him. Such a claim held little sway with American superiors, who time and again felt marginalized, belittled, and openly undercut by a marshal treating them like eager novices in need of British direction. The tension didn't ignite from lofty strategy debates, but from a more intimate issue: regard, or its absence. Starting with initial meetings in North Africa and lasting to Germany's ultimate surrender, U.S. officers learned that Montgomery's interactions with them exposed biases about American skill, valor, and value, wounds that stung worse than any combat rift. On March 6, 1943, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the arid gusts bore the bitter scent of scorched machinery and rout over the terrain as Lieutenant General George S. Patton disembarked his aircraft to take charge of the Reeling the Two Corps. Just 20 days prior, German troops led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had mauled U.S. elements in their debut clash with battle-hardened Wehrmacht forces. The rout proved total, mortifying, and revealing. What Patton encountered wasn't just a disheartened outfit, but a British hierarchy that deemed American units undependable sidekicks needing strict monitoring. General Sir Harold Alexander, the fresh British head of the 18th Army Group directing all Allied land operations in Tunisia, had penned an assessment of U.S. fighting ability that sounded like a formal charge. U.S. leaders wanted for seasoning, their soldiers missed rigor, their outfits demanded heavy British watchfulness before earning key duties. The critique wasn't wholly off base. Kasserine Pass had laid bare real shortcomings in American direction, methods, and integrated warfare execution. But Alexander's approach exceeded helpful feedback. To him, two corps ought to handle secondary tasks as British units drove the main thrusts. Patton grasped the peril right away. This went beyond simply besting Rommel. It involved demonstrating that U.S. military might could hold its own beside British equivalents. Patton regarded the British as peers. In his journal notes from that era, he recorded the arrogance of the Brits and his resolve to demonstrate U.S. capabilities via bold maneuvers. Montgomery, leading the British Eighth Army as it moved into Tunisia from the east, personified the very attitudes that irked Patton. The hero of El Alamein exuded the assurance of a leader who had turned the tide for Britain in the North African sands. He had pushed Rommel across the continent via systematic, meticulously planned advances that relied on massive resource advantages over flashy maneuvers. His men relied on him since he secured triumphs without squandering their lives pointlessly. Yet his demeanor implied that he alone grasped the essence of contemporary combat, and that everyone else, especially the Americans, had plenty to absorb. Alexander's strategy for the concluding push in Tunisia mirrored these preconceptions. The Eighth Army under Montgomery would strike the decisive assault on the Mareth Line, the Axis defenses in southern Tunisia. Patton's II Corps would carry out auxiliary assaults, diverting German focus from Montgomery's central thrust. The U.S. units would act as a buffer for Montgomery, permitting the British to claim the honor of piercing through to Tunis. The scheme possessed sound strategic rationale. Montgomery directed battle-hardened units with a track record of prevailing over German tanks. Patton oversaw outfits still honing their skills. Yet the division of roles implied more than mere operational caution. It set precedents that would trouble U.S. leaders across the conflict. British units in the vanguard, Americans in backup roles, British officers garnering acclaim, while U.S. successes remained overlooked or downplayed. Patton initiated his push toward El Guadr on March 17, 1943. Eager to validate American prowess with daring tactics, his directives echoed his own character, blending operational advice with calls for forceful command. Leaders were to advance at the forefront. U.S. soldiers were to display the same fierce drive that marked their involvement in World War I. No matter the toll, II Corps would establish itself as a fighting outfit, not mere garrison forces. The clash at El Guadr offered redemption. On March 23, 50 tanks from the German 10th Panzer Division rolled out of mountain routes into the valley, launching a pre-dawn strike meant to crumble American lines. The ensuing events stunned the German officers. U.S. guns, sighted with precision to create interlocking kill zones, poured ruinous barrages onto the oncoming tanks. Tank destroyers, deployed to leverage the landscape, clashed with the panzers at distances that offset German edge in maneuvers. By nightfall, the field lay strewn with wrecked German machines, and the 10th Panzer Division had ground to a halt. For the first time, American troops had bested seasoned German tank formations in prolonged fighting. Yet the triumph left a sour edge. Alexander's command post, preoccupied with Montgomery's moves against the Mareth Line, gave scant notice to II Corps' accomplishments. British planners kept dispensing intricate directives to Patton, overseeing U.S. actions in a fashion that betrayed ongoing skepticism about American skill. Even more infuriating, Alexander kept altering II Corps' goals, adjusting focuses in a manner that seemed crafted to keep American units as mere adjuncts to British efforts. Patton received commands to press forward, then pause, to strike with tanks, then with foot soldiers. Every shift hampered U.S. efforts and underscored that II Corps' role was chiefly to aid Montgomery's designs, not pursue its own aims. When Montgomery at last assailed the Mareth Line on March 20th, his opening drive yielded scant headway against staunch German opposition. He responded by redirecting his primary force into a flanking move, showcasing the adaptability that defined his finest campaigns. However, the adjustment demanded delay, giving the Germans time to fortify fresh lines. When the Eighth Army finally penetrated, the chance for a crushing chase had slipped away. II Corps pressed on with its flanking operations in central Tunisia, pulling German reinforcements from Montgomery's sector. American units progressed reliably, seizing targets and dealing losses to Axis troops. But these feats drew little recognition in British accounts. Montgomery's penetration earned lavish coverage. Patton's input, vital to the broader effort, got barely a nod. During the triumph procession in Tunis on May 20, 1943, where General Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud reviewed the troops, The story highlighted British and French feats, while U.S. roles earned only brief mention. For U.S. leaders, the Tunisia fight offered scant. These insights extended far past mere strategies and supply chains. Serving with the British required battling not only for triumphs, but also for acknowledgement. They realized that Montgomery, despite his strategic prowess, appeared unable to regard U.S. troops as true equals, viewing them instead as eager but inexperienced learners. Moreover, they started to sense that this mindset stemmed not solely from Montgomery's character, but from a wider reluctance among the British to acknowledge the alliance's power dynamics had permanently tilted in Washington's favor. Such realizations would foreshadow events as the Allies shifted focus to their subsequent goal. Sicily, July 10, 1943, Gulf of Jala, Sicily. What remained the biggest seaborne offensive up to that time surged toward Sicily's coastlines amid darkness and turbulent waves, launching Operation Husky, the assault on Italy's biggest island. More than 8 divisions, split between General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army and General George Patton's American 7th Army, hit the beaches stretching from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse, an effort that would strain Allied cohesion just as severely as it challenged the German and Italian fortifications. From the start, Operation Husky's blueprint sparked intense debates. Early ideas called for spread-out landings throughout Sicily to capture harbors swiftly, securing supplies for later advances. Montgomery rejected such scattered approaches outright. His North African campaigns had taught him that massing strength was essential, while dividing forces risked piecemeal destruction. On April 24, 1943, he voiced his concerns and suggested a different course. Focus every landing on the island's southeast tip, assigning the 8th Army the straightforward task of advancing directly to Messina, Sicily's northeast harbor and the entryway to Italy's mainland. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who oversaw the aerial and sea efforts respectively, resisted Montgomery's idea. It would keep 13 Axis airstrips active, endangering the invasion armada with too much risk. It would also force vessels to cluster in confined seas, exposed to aerial strikes. Their arguments held significant sway, given the esteem both had built through proven successes. Montgomery's reply showcased the intensity of his temperament. Backed by Churchill, he warned of quitting if forced to follow what he saw as a deeply defective scheme. To avert a breakdown that could sabotage the whole operation, Eisenhower convened a session on May 2 to settle the conflict, a gathering that revealed rifts destined to deepen across the conflict. Montgomery argued his position with near-insolent assurance. Tedder and Cunningham countered firmly, stressing the need to neutralize airfields and safeguard sea routes. Eisenhower, weighing operational demands against alliance diplomacy, eventually backed Montgomery. The assaults would target southeast Sicily, with the 8th Army heading for Messina and the 7th Army covering the 8th's left side. For Patton, reviewing the settled outline in North Africa as he readied his unit for the push, the meaning was crystal clear. His 7th Army faced a backup function. Montgomery would spearhead the primary thrust. The British aimed to seize Messina, leaving Americans to shield their side. Yet again, U.S. units drew subordinate duties while British leaders chased accolades. The ruling irked for more than just Patton's outsized pride. By July 1943, U.S. presence in the Mediterranean had expanded markedly. The 7th Army included 3 infantry divisions, 1 armored division, and ample auxiliary units, a lineup matching the 8th Army's scale. U.S. manufacturing was overwhelming Allied reserves with gear. American aviation ruled the Mediterranean airspace, but the leadership framework still positioned U.S. troops as supplements, used at British whim. Patton's journal note from July 12 laid bare his anger with stark honesty. Alexander and his all-British team had come to 7th Army HQ to outline the battle scheme, which Patton believed blocked any chance for Americans to reach Messina. He remarked sourly that Alexander, overseeing both British and U.S. armies, showed up without a single American aid. "What idiots we are," Patton scrawled, grasping that U.S. policymakers had endorsed a setup ensuring American sidelining. The actual beach assaults proceeded fairly smoothly. notwithstanding disorganized drops that left British and American airborne units dispersed over the landscape, with many perishing as their gliders plunged into the Mediterranean. Come first light on July 10th, both forces had claimed their footholds and were advancing into the interior. Early pushback from Italian shore units collapsed rapidly. German thrusts against Gela Beach, site of Patton's landings, got repelled thanks to shipboard barrages, and resolute combat involving the 1st Infantry Division erupted. Montgomery, assured that Axis opposition would crumble under steady British advances, notified Alexander that the path to Messina was clear. His 8th Army intended to push directly along the eastern shoreline. Patton's 7th Army ought to maintain a defensive stance, safeguarding the flank of the 8th Army as Montgomery chased what he believed to be a disheartened foe. This communication laid bare Montgomery's presumptions. The British troops were set to land the decisive strike. The Americans would ensure protection. But harsh facts intervened without delay. Far from disintegrating, German units fortified robust defensive lines, taking advantage of Sicily's rugged hills and mountains. The 8th Army's momentum faltered below Catania, where German airborne soldiers occupied spots that funneled British assaults into deadly traps. Montgomery's deliberate tactics, which had triumphed in the North African sands, now faltered against opponents who could mass their strength on confined sectors and battle from entrenched spots. On July 12th, with the 8th Army's push grinding to a halt, Montgomery dispatched a message to Alexander that would shape Anglo-American dynamics for the rest of the conflict. He advocated for the 8th Army to broaden its zone to the west, essentially seizing a vital route allocated to the 7th Army. This wider span would enable him to bypass German strongholds, obstructing his path. He recommended that American units pause and fortify, allowing the 8th Army to launch the assault that would bisect Sicily. The message's phrasing carried as much weight as its substance. Montgomery skipped seeking Alexander's consent. Instead, he declared his plans to Alexander and implied that American operations should adapt. The audacity stunned observers. Montgomery sought to claim American sectors, confine U.S. forces to immobile guarding, and pursue a plan ensuring only British units would earn a claim for subduing Sicily. Alexander, whose regard for Montgomery surpassed his faith in U.S. leaders, concurred. On July 13th, he released directives granting Montgomery the contested highway and directing Patton to adopt a holding pattern as the 8th Army pressed onward. To the U.S. officers reviewing the directive, the implication rang clear. British priorities would dictate combined strategy, irrespective of American efforts or potential. Patton's first reaction underscored the diplomatic limits that bedeviled U.S. leaders across the war. Though his private notes vented rage, likening Montgomery to a haughty diva and Alexander to a bumbling toady, Patton officially acknowledged the command sans objection. He grasped that Eisenhower, overseeing Allied efforts in the Mediterranean, couldn't tolerate outright defiance from underlings. Joint operations demanded concessions and flexibility, even if it involved choking down rightful indignation. Yet Patton refused to let the 7th Army languish inactive as Montgomery chased triumph. If Alexander wouldn't grant Americans a starring role, Patton would forge one. He journeyed to Alexander's command post on July 17th, armed with a chart and a scheme. Instead of mere passive guarding, the 7th Army would surge northwest to Palermo, Sicily's chief city and key harbor. This maneuver would slice the island apart, ensnare Italian troops in the west, and claim docking sites to alleviate U.S. logistics woes. Alexander, caught off guard by Patton's boldness or eager to redirect American zeal from Montgomery's domain, endorsed it. This choice reshaped the Sicily operation entirely. No longer just a lone British thrust up the east side, backed by U.S. shielding actions, the Allies now pursued dual offensives. Montgomery would persist in driving toward Messina from south and east. Patton would dash to Palermo, then veer east and charge toward Messina via Sicily's north shore. An operational tweak swiftly evolved into a rivalry of egos. Patton, intent on showcasing U.S. prowess and arriving at Messina ahead of Montgomery, urged his forces with his trademark fervor. The 7th Army advanced at a pace that astonished comrades and adversaries alike, traversing tough landscapes at speeds Montgomery's cautious method couldn't rival. Only 12 days post-invasion, U.S. soldiers seized Palermo on July 22, taking Sicily's biggest urban center and a prime harbor. Meanwhile, Montgomery kept battling entrenched German lines south of Mount Etna. His gains were steady, disciplined, and growing less pivotal to the overall result. Sensing Sicily's inevitable loss, German commanders started readying a withdrawal to Italy's mainland. The issue shifted from Allied conquest to which force would hit Messina first and seize the emblematic prize. The dash to Messina exposed personalities as vividly as skills. Patton strained the Seventh Army to its breaking point. Deep Patton's unyielding push forward persisted without regard for hurdles or losses. His key subordinates, familiar with his approach, pushed their units aggressively. U.S. engineers fixed roadways and spans with impressive efficiency. American foot soldiers trudged through scorching conditions and rugged landscapes at rates that outstripped their rear elements. In contrast, Montgomery's Eighth Army, up against fiercer resistance and tougher ground, progressed deliberately. British leaders, schooled in conserving lives and supplies, avoided gambles that might lead to catastrophe just for quicker gains. This disparity highlighted deep divides in U.S. and U.K. military traditions. With abundant personnel and manufacturing power, Americans could tolerate bold maneuvers and substantial tolls. The British, battling since 1939 amid shrinking forces and a drained economy, had no such luxury. Yet the contest carried a personal edge. Montgomery's open remarks and confidential letters showed he regarded the Eighth Army's task as weightier and more challenging than the Seventh Army's efforts. From his viewpoint, the Americans' arrival at Palermo proved little of note. Patton had encountered feeble Italian foes in less critical areas. The Eighth Army, however, tangled with seasoned Germans in defensively advantageous spots. The parallel Montgomery drew rang hollow. U.S. officers interpreted his downplaying of their feats as typical British arrogance. They recalled parallel judgments from the Tunisia campaign. U.S. triumphs got understated. U.S. struggles got chalked up to greenness. U.S. leaders faced condescension as eager yet unpolished. Such views implied that British esteem for American prowess was tentative, granted mainly when U.S. units followed British direction and served British aims. On August 17, 1943, parts of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division reached Messina well ahead of British arrivals. The 7th Army claimed the sprint, yet the triumph felt empty, mirroring the strained dynamics among Allied superiors. Montgomery's outward reply blended courtesy with understated rejection. He praised Patton but stressed the Eighth Army's ordeals and hinted that geography, not skill, accounted for results. UK media echoed Montgomery's angle. Stories lauded the Eighth Army's clashes with Germans, while portraying the Seventh Army's push as a minor affair against lesser enemies. American accomplishments gained mention but got undercut, shown as supportive of, not on par with, British endeavors. To U.S. leaders scanning these pieces, the point was obvious. British accounts would perpetually spotlight British successes, no matter the facts. The Sicily operation inflicted wounds that lingered unresolved. U.S. officers proved their troops could rival British ones in pace and fighting prowess, but acknowledgement from British peers stayed reluctant and qualified. Montgomery, above all, appeared inherently reluctant to admit that American generals could rival his expertise, or that U.S. units merited praise matching their roles. 2 episodes in Sicily worsened the tensions further. On August 3rd and once more on August 10th, Patton struck wounded troops he branded as cowards, sparking an uproar that dogged his legacy. Upon hearing, Montgomery reacted with icy scorn. Patton's actions validated British notions of American laxity and impulsiveness. A British general, he intimated, would never falter so. The other episode centered on a junior British lieutenant, Montgomery, assigned to Patton's base as a contact. The officer showed up with a string-bound valise and a disheveled look that infuriated Patton. Before this, Patton had forwarded Montgomery a proper delegation featuring a colonel, a major, and a full signal outfit. Montgomery, in turn, sent just one low-ranking man with scant gear. Patton returned the lieutenant with a message stating he couldn't allow youngsters in his command post. The matter was trivial, bordering on absurd, yet it epitomized the offhand disdain in Montgomery's dealings with American equals. Patton led an army matching Montgomery's 8th in scale. by norms of military decorum, he warranted contact personnel of suitable stature and ability. Montgomery's omission signaled he treated the Seventh Army as lesser, irrespective of formal hierarchies. As Allied strategists shifted focus to the Italian landing and later, Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault on France, one truth stood firm. Bernard Montgomery saw himself as the foremost Allied. As a top British general, Montgomery anticipated respect from his U.S. counterparts, yet he appeared oblivious, or indifferent, to how U.S. leaders increasingly saw him as the main barrier to true collaboration between the Allies. On September 1, 1944, in northern France, the Allies' escape from Normandy had demolished German lines across the country, forcing Wehrmacht units into a chaotic flight toward the east. Paris fell to liberation on August 25, 1944, in scenes of wild celebration that hinted at the conflict's swift conclusion. From the Normandy shores to Belgium, Allied troops chased the routed Germans over landscapes that, only months before, had seemed impregnable to their advance. Triumph by Christmas felt tantalizingly close for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, fresh from his promotion and reveling in the triumph of the Normandy campaign. This juncture called for daring moves. He had overseen every Allied land unit in the Normandy assault, a role bolstered by his prior triumphs in North Africa and Sicily that solidified his reputation as the UK's premier wartime leader. With the German ranks in turmoil, Montgomery spotted a chance to wrap up the war through one crushing push. Yet, September 1st also introduced a shift that ignited Montgomery's scarcely hidden rage. General Dwight Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, took direct oversight of all ground troops. Montgomery, who had directed operations for both U.S. and British units in Normandy, found himself relegated to leading just the 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian elements operating in Northwest Europe. Meanwhile, his U.S. equivalent, General Omar Bradley, directed the 12th Army Group, encompassing the American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. Such a transition was unavoidable. U.S. personnel in Europe now far exceeded British and Canadian numbers. American supply chains fueled the entire Allied effort. U.S. aviation ruled the continent's airspace. American factories supplied the essential gear for success. In political terms, it made sense for Americans to helm a force that was predominantly theirs. Montgomery grasped the underlying dynamics, but rejected both the logic and the consequences. To him, splitting authority across various commands weakened the unified direction essential for winning. Eisenhower, for all his diplomatic finesse, simply didn't possess the combat savvy to guide land campaigns properly. Montgomery grew more vocal in asserting that the top commander's duties ought to focus solely on diplomacy and supplies. Tactical leadership, he contended, needed to stay unified under one expert ground commander, ideally someone with his track record. This idea clearly favored Montgomery. Still, he framed it as a strategic imperative, not self-interest. Eisenhower's approach of pushing into Germany via a wide front, with several armies striking at once, struck Montgomery as fundamentally flawed. It spread out assets, blocked focused assaults, and ensured the fight would stretch into 1945. Montgomery's counterplan embodied his typical audacity and ego. Instead of a sweeping advance, the Allies should mass troops for a potent drive into northern Germany. This offensive would ford the Rhine, capture the Ruhr's factories, and reach Berlin ahead of any solid German regrouping. Montgomery, of course, would lead this pivotal campaign, with U.S. units offering backup and securing the sides. The plan's tactical strengths were open to question. A slender penetration far into enemy territory risked forming a thin corridor open to flanking strikes. It meant halting other initiatives, letting Germans mass against the spearhead. Success hinged on seizing bridges whole and sustaining logistics across vast disputed ground. Above all, it presumed German opposition had crumbled enough for a fast march with little resistance. Yet the scheme's diplomatic fallout was crystal clear. Montgomery urged U.S. officials to place their forces under British oversight for a mission that would let UK troops, guided by a UK leader, land the knockout punch. He sought American soldiers as his protective buffer while he claimed the ultimate win. Effectively, he pressed Eisenhower to yield tactical authority to a junior officer who openly disdained the Supreme Commander's planning. Eisenhower, juggling operational demands with alliance diplomacy, opted for a middle path. He refused to funnel every resource into Montgomery's northern drive, but Eisenhower would prioritize Montgomery's needs for resources and greenlight a restricted campaign to grab bridges over the Rhine in the Netherlands. Dubbed Operation Market Garden, the strategy involved deploying 3 airborne divisions to secure crossings at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Then, British ground troops would push swiftly over those bridges, set up a foothold beyond the Rhine, and gear up for follow-on pushes into Germany. To U.S. leaders like Bradley and Patton, Montgomery's new proposal only fueled their deepest fears. The field marshal was trying yet again to sideline American units in secondary positions while his British forces chased the spotlight. He was clamoring for supplies that could have fueled U.S. drives in central France instead, and he was pushing a venture where the dangers appeared vastly out of proportion to any possible rewards. Patton, at the helm of the Third Army surging toward Germany via eastern France, blew up upon hearing that fuel shipments were being rerouted to Montgomery. His command had proven in August that bold U.S. thrusts could outpace and outdistance the more hesitant British efforts. The Third Army was nearing the German frontier and the Ruhr River. But Eisenhower was pausing American offensives to back a British commander whose history pointed to plotting restraint over daring action. Bradley, typically more tactful than Patton, echoed his colleague's irritation. Montgomery kept asking for assets, warning of grave fallout if refused, and got top billing no matter U.S. priorities or successes. As Bradley saw it, the dynamics of Allied command ensured British pleas got a fair shake, even though American troops supplied most of the coalition's fighting strength. On September 17, 1944, in the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden kicked off with the biggest paratroop assault ever. More than 35,000 U.S. and British jumpers parachuted from planes and soared into Dutch countryside, charged with taking bridges before Germans could blow them. British armor under XXX Corps started rolling northward on a lone road, hurrying to rescue the airborne soldiers before enemy pushback crushed them. The whole effort collapsed utterly. Scouts had spotted German tank groups close to Arnhem, the top target, but those alerts got brushed aside. Paratroopers touched down too distant from goals, giving Germans time to rally. That narrow road turned into a kill zone, with British vehicles stuck in place or unable to veer off into surrounding swamps. Far from crumbling, German opposition grew fiercer as Wehrmacht leaders grasped the danger and hurried more troops to the fray. At Arnhem's Bridge, British airborne under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost clung to one side amid impossible odds for several days, awaiting help that never arrived. XXX Corps, bogged down by enemy strikes and blocked by wrecked spans, failed to get to Arnhem. When the plug was pulled on September 25th, more than 17,000 Allied personnel lay dead, injured, or taken. The toll hit about 6,400 jumpers who dropped at Arnhem, the majority now killed or captives. Defeat was absolute. The Rhine stayed uncrossed. German lines in the Netherlands grew firm. The Allies' drive, which looked invincible at September's start, fizzled out in Dutch pastures and on a route the British dubbed Hell's Highway. And the chance to wrap up the war that year slipped away in what became Montgomery's gravest blunder. U.S. responses mixed triumph with rage. Patton and Bradley had resisted Market Garden, insisting its hazards dwarfed any upsides. They'd urged redirecting Montgomery's funding to keep American surges toward Germany rolling. Their protests got ignored, overridden by alliance politics and Montgomery's unyielding confidence. With the flop now plain, American brass felt justified as outcomes backed their views. Yet that vindication drowned in outrage over Montgomery's handling of the mess. Instead of owning the venture he'd dreamed up, orchestrated, and led, he branded Market Garden 90% victorious. The spans at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were taken. Allies freed big chunks of Dutch land. That Arnhem, the key aim, remained out of reach, got downplayed as a small hiccup in a broadly winning effort, the assertion stunned with its deceit. Market Garden aimed to plant a Rhine bridgehead. It hadn't. The push racked up over 17,000 losses for zero tactical payoff. Still, Montgomery proclaimed triumph, spinning flop into win through pure audacity. This trait defined his character. U.S. leaders saw through the tactic clearly. Montgomery was safeguarding his image at the expense of honesty. Successes belonged entirely to him. When missions stumbled, he pointed to limited supplies, lack of backing, or mistakes by colleagues. He never shouldered blame for defeats in his accounts, yet his gravest misstep lay ahead. Following Market Garden, as Allied forces shifted to slow, hard-fought pushes against fortified German lines, Montgomery started openly attacking Eisenhower's tactics. In statements to the British media and messages to Churchill, he claimed the wide front strategy had wasted a chance for a knockout blow. If his strategy had been followed, if he'd gotten the supplies and power he sought, the conflict would have ended. Such arguments overlooked harsh truths. Montgomery had been given ample assets for Market Garden. Its downfall stemmed from poor preparation, errors in intelligence, and overconfidence in German weaknesses, not from skimpy aid. Still, Montgomery's version turned tactical blunders into a lost chance, blamed on the narrow vision of others. To American generals, this evasion proved the field marshal would never own up to his own faults. Each reversal turned into another's fault. Each victory stood as his alone. This habit revealed more than ego. It exposed a deep inability to reflect critically on himself, rendering Montgomery a threat to Allied cohesion, despite his ongoing battlefield prowess. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. As day broke, German troops unleashed their final major push in the west, surging through the Ardennes in a bold bid to divide Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. The strike caught everyone off guard, breaking into lightly defended U.S. sectors and forming a salient in the lines that named the fight. For 10 days, the result teetered uncertainly while German vanguards pushed toward the Meuse River, risking a split in Allied fronts and an endless extension of the war. The Battle of the Bulge marked Montgomery's peak achievement and deepest flaw at once. His command proved outstanding. When Eisenhower handed over control of the American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, the field marshal swiftly brought structure to the chaotic defenses. He deployed British reinforcements to guard the Meuse bridges. He orchestrated U.S. counterstrikes. He showed, amid real peril, the reasons Britain trusted his guidance. Yet Montgomery's behavior post-battle planted seeds of resentment that lingered long after victory. On January 7, 1945, as Germans withdrew in disarray and Allied success was certain, Montgomery convened a news briefing meant to honor U.S. fighters and back Eisenhower. Instead, it unfolded as a lesson in ego-boosting, masked as generous praise. Montgomery opened by lauding the valor of American troops, but he soon shifted to outlining his own moves after assuming command, steps framed as bold fixes that rescued U.S. units from collapse. As soon as I grasped the situation, Montgomery stated, I implemented specific measures to make sure that if the Germans reached the Meuse, they wouldn't cross it. He went on, detailing how he had straightened out the chaos, anticipated threats, and secured even deployments. The engagement, he wrapped up, had been fascinating, perhaps the most challenging and intriguing one he'd ever managed. In his telling, British efforts shone, Montgomery's genius took center stage, and U.S. leaders vanished from the story. The whole display amounted to a deliberate slight, wrapped in flattery. Montgomery extolled American bravery while hinting they'd been pulled from ruin by his masterful oversight. He acknowledged U.S. grit yet implied their officers had floundered until British expertise restored control. And he recast a fierce holding action, secured mostly by American outfits, like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and Patton's swift southern thrust as his personal win. The U.S. response erupted in fury. Bradley, scanning news of the event, sensed deep disloyalty. Montgomery had led 2 American armies for just over 3 weeks. Those forces had battled superbly, standing firm against vast superiority until the German drive ran dry. Patton's Third Army had pulled off a stunning riposte, swinging 90 degrees through harsh winter to free Bastogne. American fighters had sacrificed dearly to crush Hitler's last throw. Yet Montgomery's account downplayed Amiens. He downplayed the vital input from American troops and positioned himself as the pivotal figure. This wasn't just self-importance, it amounted to historical appropriation, an effort to recast the U.S. triumph as a British bailout. U.S. leaders grasped Montgomery's true perspective on the matter. He truly thought his involvement had rescued the American units. He found no issue in taking ownership of a fight that his troops had decisively won after barely a month under his lead. The media event sparked a near collapse in leadership. Bradley informed Eisenhower of his rage, unrestrained by any sense of tact. He insisted he couldn't continue serving beneath Montgomery. Should Eisenhower plan to grant the British general lasting authority over U.S. troops, Bradley would step down. This was no empty warning. Bradley, typically the smoothest diplomat among American generals, had hit his limit. Eisenhower, aware that the alliance teetered on the edge, sought to soothe Bradley while quietly preparing a note to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There, he made it clear he would seek Montgomery's removal if the general didn't offer an apology and stop his open attacks. Eisenhower suggested the conflict was over, yet the partnership's endurance post-victory was far from assured. Resolution came only through heavy British insistence, compelling Montgomery to admit his mistake. On January 12th, Montgomery penned a letter to Eisenhower voicing remorse and admitting his remarks had offended. To Bradley, he dispatched a reconciliatory note, lauding U.S. soldiers and thanking for the privilege of their brief oversight. The messages came across as courteous, seemingly heartfelt, yet ultimately pointless. The harm lingered. U.S. generals now saw unmistakably that Montgomery would always treat them as lesser allies. Each mission would pass through his lens of personal prestige. Any setback would get blamed on lacking aid or others' faults. Any achievement would serve as proof of Montgomery's insight. This habit was entrenched, foreseeable, and unacceptable. Yet stakes went beyond personal rifts. By the start of 1945, Europe's military dynamics had tilted so sharply toward U.S. superiority that Montgomery's claims to overall command turned from annoying to strategically harmful. U.S. armies included more than 60 divisions. British and Canadian units totaled under 20. U.S. supply lines fueled the entire Allied effort. U.S. aviation ruled the continent's airspace. Still, Montgomery acted like British expertise alone could steer American might. This clash mirrored wider strains in U.S.-British ties. Britain, drained after 5 years of fighting and bracing for post-war financial ruin, grappled with losing its worldwide edge. The U.S., rising as the globe's leading force, was learning that such power brought governing duties its heritage hadn't equipped it for. Montgomery's refusal to adapt to these shifts turned him into an emblem of Britain's challenge in embracing its reduced standing. Winston Churchill, observing the fallout from Montgomery's briefing debacle, spotted the risk. He addressed Parliament on January 18th, choosing his phrasing with precision to mend coalition bonds. The Battle of the Bulge, he affirmed, stood mainly as an American conflict, an American success, destined to endure as a legendary U.S. feat. British units had offered aid, fitting for allies in a joint venture. The address was a required diplomatic fix, overturning Montgomery's account and affirming battlefield truths, while also signaling Britain's nod to the war's concluding phases as chiefly American-led. British troops would join, aid, and partake in the win. But U.S. leaders would more and more shape plans, oversee actions, and take the recognition their troop superiority earned. Montgomery, sidelined by his actions and fading from relevance in U.S.-dominated campaigns, passed the war's closing phase, leading 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His efforts stayed competent. His battlefield instincts held firm, yet his ties with American generals never mended. Bradley steered clear. Patton held him in contempt. Eisenhower endured him out of political need, but no longer relied on his decisions or intentions. May 8, 1945. Germany capitulated without conditions. The European theater ended. Success fell to a united Allied front that had defeated not only Nazi Germany, but also the inner fractures that often risked splintering it. Amid peace's jubilation, past disputes faded for the moment. Montgomery garnered praise from a thankful British populace. American generals headed back to post-war festivities honored the accomplishments of Allied leaders. Yet, in post-war memoirs and accounts, long-standing disputes re-emerged. Montgomery's 1958 autobiography stirred up past quarrels by faulting Eisenhower and suggesting that his own operational foresight had outshone others. Eisenhower, serving as U.S. president at the time, severed private ties, declining to exchange letters with an old associate intent on relitigating fights from a bygone conflict. Bradley's 1951 volume carefully chronicled episodes where Montgomery's actions had hampered joint efforts. Patton's diary, released after his death, exposed the intensity of his disdain for the British general. U.S. wartime narratives, informed by these narratives and archival materials, depicted Montgomery as gifted, yet challenging, insightful, yet intolerable, a leader whose input proved valuable, though his temperament posed risks to collaborative campaigns. UK scholars championed Montgomery, contending that U.S. officers failed to value his systematic methods, his regard for troop losses, his nuanced planning. They pointed out his unbroken record in key engagements since taking charge in North Africa. They highlighted how his meticulous organization ensured the triumph of the Normandy invasion. They posited that U.S. objections stemmed from envy toward British expertise and bitterness over long-standing UK martial heritage. The contention persisted long after the key figures passed away. Scholars debated Montgomery's actual impact, the validity of U.S. irritations, the influence of individual traits on combat endeavors. Certain analysts deemed him an exceptional tactician, ill-equipped for multinational efforts. Others proposed that U.S. leaders, short on his background, chafed at his sharper insights. A few maintained that the rifts mirrored unavoidable strains when self-assured countries unite in a fight for survival. Yet, amid scholarly disputes, a fundamental reality endured, one grasped sharply by U.S. commanders in World War II. Bernard Montgomery, despite his skills, proved unable to regard American troops as peers. Whether this flaw arose from individual hubris, ingrained biases, or a UK resolve to uphold waning authority stayed open to question. Undeniably, however, his behavior soured joint ties and erected avoidable barriers to unified strategy. The U.S. dealings with Montgomery yielded insights that endured beyond the conflict. Subsequent joint missions would be organized to avert character clashes from eroding operational success. Leadership setups would aim for balanced input and block any country from prevailing merely via greater assertiveness or past legacies. Moreover, U.S. armed forces ethos would absorb a caution against partners who mistook alliance for subservience. To those Americans who battled beside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the field marshal embodied the outdated notions they thought discarded in 1776. The notion that UK expertise should steer U.S. power, that frontier zeal demanded imperial refinement for victory, that youthful vigor required veteran guidance to sidestep catastrophe. They learned that combat prowess, manufacturing power, and triumph in arms could not dispel ingrained views forged over ages of British worldwide rule. Montgomery never grasped this. Until his passing in 1976, he insisted his wartime actions were fitting, his rebukes warranted, his broader outlook better than rivals. He stayed persuaded that Eisenhower's direction fell short, that U.S. officers wanted his expertise, that victory might have arrived earlier with his counsel heeded. Surviving U.S. commanders delivered contrasting judgments. They recognized his battlefield prowess, but doubted his overarching decisions. They lauded his thorough groundwork, but stressed that conflicts demand daring alongside prudence. They granted his focus on minimizing deaths, but remarked that his restraint occasionally permitted foes to evade ruin, and they agreed almost without exception that his demeanor complicated multinational operations needlessly. The ultimate evaluation came from Eisenhower, reflecting long after the events. He conceded Montgomery's talents, but underscored the general's utter failure to comprehend the relational aspects of shared leadership. Montgomery, Eisenhower determined, was an individual of clear martial ability, yet his dearth of relational acumen rendered him unfit for top roles in coalition endeavors. It may have been the sharpest condemnation imaginable, not a shortfall in martial skill, but his strengths were ultimately eclipsed by flaws that eroded the very objectives he championed. In joint military operations, where individual temperament influences outcomes as deeply as battlefield maneuvers or grand plans, Montgomery's refusal to view fellow nations as equals rendered him not just challenging, but a genuine liability. The U.S. forces grasped this harsh truth the hard way. From the deserts of North Africa to the quagmires of Germany, they came to realize that wartime partnerships extend far beyond common foes. Such bonds necessitate reciprocal esteem, recognition of each side's efforts, and a readiness to place personal pride below the greater mission. Montgomery, for all his merits elsewhere, fell short on these essentials. And therein resides the explanation for the deep animosity the Americans harbored toward Monty. It stemmed not from his British heritage, nor from his prudent approach, but from how he reduced them to mere subordinate forces in a conflict they helped secure. Troops whose sacrifices counted, yet whose insights were dismissed. Partners esteemed solely for advancing British triumphs. That lingering resentment endured beyond Montgomery's era, beyond the soldiers who campaigned beside him, and even beyond the post-war NATO ties forged from those shared struggles. It stands as an enduring caution that operational mastery alone cannot replace interpersonal courtesy. That tactical prowess avails little when it estranges the very collaborators essential for success. Bernard Montgomery embodied numerous roles: masterful strategist, meticulous leader, national icon of Britain. Yet, to the American servicemen who shared the front lines with him, he also exemplified the pitfalls of strategic acumen untethered from interpersonal savvy. The issue was never doubt about Montgomery's abilities on the part of the Americans. They acknowledged them fully. The real dilemma was Montgomery's own blindness to their capabilities. He possessed none. And in that deficit of foresight originated a grudge so profound that even collective triumphs failed to heal it.